Picture this. It's the Wednesday before Thanksgiving, November 24th, 1971. Portland International Airport is buzzing with the kind of restless, impatient energy that only the holiday season can produce. Families, businessmen, tired mothers with children tugging at their sleeves. Everyone moving, everyone rushed, everyone with somewhere to be. And then there's him. He walks through the terminal with the kind of quiet confidence that most people never quite manage to fake. Medium height. Dark sunglasses. A black suit that's decent but not expensive. A neatly pressed white shirt and a black clip-on tie that hangs just right. A brown paper bag under one arm. A briefcase in the other hand. Nobody notices him. That's the thing. That is the absolute thing that will haunt investigators for the next 50 years. Nobody notices him. Nobody thinks anything of him. Because he looks like 1,000 other businessmen who pass through this terminal every single week. He is deliberately, almost surgically, unremarkable. He walks up to the Northwest Orient Airlines ticket counter, calm as a man buying a newspaper, and he purchases a one-way ticket. Cash. The name he gives the ticket agent is Dan Cooper. One-way ticket. Flight 305. Portland to Seattle. $30. He takes his boarding pass, tucks it into his jacket, picks up his briefcase, and walks toward the gate without a single backward glance. In exactly 2 hours, this man will hand a flight attendant a note. In 3 hours, he will have $200,000 in untraceable $20 bills. In 4 hours, he will strap on a parachute, open a door at the back of a commercial airliner flying through a pitch-black November storm, and jump into the darkness. And then he will simply vanish. Forever. No body ever recovered. No confirmed accomplice ever found. No definitive conclusion ever reached. The case of D.B. Cooper remains, to this day, the only unsolved commercial airline hijacking in the entire history of American aviation. This is not a story about a crime. Well, it is. But it's more than that. This is a story about an idea. About a ghost. About the thing that happens when a human being pulls off something so audacious, so perfectly timed, and so strangely elegant that 50 years later, the entire country still can't quite decide whether to call him a criminal or a legend. This is the full story. Every detail. Every suspect. Every dead end. Every theory. Pull up a chair. Because we're going all the way in. To understand D.B. Cooper, you first have to understand the world he stepped into. Because 1971 wasn't just a year on a calendar. It was a pressure cooker. It was a country at the breaking point, barely held together with fraying rope. The Vietnam War was still raging. 58,000 American men would eventually die in that jungle. And by 1971, the country knew it. The protests had gotten louder. The photographs had gotten more brutal. A generation of young Americans had watched their government lie to them, draft their brothers, ship them 8,000 miles away, and bring them back in boxes. Trust was dead. Not wounded. Not limping. Dead. Nixon was in the White House, and the Watergate scandal was still a year away from erupting, but the rot was already there beneath the surface. People could feel it. That specific, sick feeling of knowing that the people running things don't care about you. That the rules are for everyone except the ones making them. And then there was the economy. Inflation was biting. The dream that your parents had sold you, work hard, play fair, get your piece of the pie, was starting to feel like exactly what it was. A story. A comfortable lie they told you so you'd stay in line. The counterculture had peaked and was now curdling into something angrier. The hippies were growing up and getting bitter. The Black Panthers were being dismantled by an FBI that was conducting what could only be described as a domestic war. The women's liberation movement was reshaping every dinner table in America. Everything was in flux. Everything felt unstable. And in this moment, this exact, specific, culturally combustible moment, airplane hijacking was having something close to a golden age. Between 1968 and 1972, there were more than 130 hijackings of American commercial aircraft. 130. Some were political. Some were people trying to get to Cuba. Some were just desperate men making desperate decisions. Airlines had not yet implemented the kind of security we think of today. You could walk up to a gate with a briefcase and a bad idea and nobody was going to stop you. Metal detectors weren't standard equipment yet. Sky marshals were rare. The whole system operated on a kind of gentle, optimistic faith that most people boarding a plane were not planning anything catastrophic. This was the world D.B. Cooper studied. Or at least, whoever he was had clearly studied it. Because the plan he executed on November 24, 1971 was not an improvisation. It was not a desperate act. It was engineered. It was specific. It was, in its own deeply unsettling way, brilliant. He chose Thanksgiving week, when airports would be busy and overwhelmed and understaffed and distracted. He chose a short domestic hop, Portland to Seattle, less than an hour of flight time, on a Boeing 727, a plane he clearly knew something about. He wore clothing that made him invisible. He paid cash. He used a false name. He had done his homework. And now, as Flight 305 begins to board, he settles into seat 18C, middle of the plane, aisle seat, away from windows, orders a bourbon and soda from the flight attendant, and he waits. Patient as stone. The plane is carrying only 36 passengers. 96 seats empty. It's a light load for a short flight on a busy travel day, and that's slightly unusual. But nobody's asking questions about that. The crew is focused on getting wheels up on time. The passengers are thinking about turkey dinners and family arguments and whether their connecting flights will be delayed. Nobody is looking at the man in seat 18C. Nobody knows that the next hour is about to change everything. Flight attendant Florence Schaffner is working the aisle. She's done this hundreds of times. The pre-takeoff routine. Check the overhead compartments. Make sure seatbelts are fastened. Smile. Be calm. Be professional. The man in 18C catches her eye as she passes. He holds out a note. Florence assumes this is what it sometimes is, a flirtatious passenger trying to give her his phone number. She's a flight attendant. It happens. She takes the note and tucks it into her pocket without reading it. But then the man leans forward slightly and speaks. "Miss," he says, his voice low and unhurried, "you'd better look at that note. I have a bomb." Florence's hand goes to her pocket. She unfolds the paper. The note, by accounts of those who saw it, says something to the effect of, "I have a bomb in my briefcase. I will use it if necessary. I want you to sit next to me. You are being hijacked." The exact wording has been disputed over the years because the note was never recovered. Cooper took it with him. But what Florence Schaffner describes is clear. The note was specific, it was calm, and it was utterly terrifying. She sits down next to him. He leans in close enough that she can see herself reflected in the lenses of his dark sunglasses. He opens his briefcase, just enough for her to see what appears to be red cylinders, wiring, a battery. Whether it was real or a brilliantly convincing fake has never been determined. In the moment, with her heart hammering behind her ribs, Florence Schaffner has absolutely no reason to question it. She asks him what he wants. And this is where D.B. Cooper reveals the architecture of his plan. He wants $200,000 in cash, he tells her. Negotiable currency. American bills, 20s preferred. He wants 4 parachutes, 2 primary, 2 reserve. He wants a fuel truck waiting in Seattle to refuel the aircraft. And he wants a meal for the crew. Florence stares at him. He says it all in the same tone of voice a man might use to order from a room service menu. Calm. Measured. No aggression. No visible anger. He's not shaking. He's not sweating. He's just sitting there in his black suit with his bourbon and soda, waiting for her to carry his message forward. She goes to the cockpit. Captain William Scott and co-pilot Bill Ratazak are informed of the situation. They contact Northwest Orient's ground operations. Ground operations contacts the airline's president. The FBI is notified. A decision is made almost immediately at the highest levels. They will comply. They will get him everything he asked for. The life of every person on that plane is more important than $200,000. Seattle-Tacoma Airport is put on alert. The FBI begins mobilizing. Law enforcement is scrambling. But the orders come down clearly from the top. Do not escalate. Do not confront. Give him what he wants. The plane begins its descent toward Seattle. Seat 18C sits in quiet darkness. He orders another bourbon. He waits. The Boeing 727 touches down at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport and taxis to a remote area of the tarmac, away from other aircraft, away from the terminal. This is standard protocol for a hijacking situation. You contain the threat. You isolate it. Cooper has requested that the plane be kept away from spotlights, away from anything he might interpret as a threat. The FBI, listening carefully, complies. There are agents out there, in the dark, watching. But they are under strict orders to hold back. For nearly 2 hours, the plane sits on the tarmac. Inside, flight attendant Tina Mucklow has taken over as the primary liaison with Cooper. She will later describe him as polite. Calm. Not cruel. He engaged her in conversation while they waited. He asked about her job. He smoked cigarette after cigarette. He seemed, she said, almost relaxed. Almost as if he'd done this before. The ransom money is being assembled by Northwest Orient and Seattle banks. $200,000 in $20 bills. But before it's handed over, the FBI does something quietly significant. They photograph every single bill. All 10,000 of them. They record every serial number. They also mark the bills with a chemical treatment that could, theoretically, be detected later. It will turn out to matter. And then, in a way, it won't. The parachutes arrive. Cooper had asked for 4. 2 front pack and 2 backpack. The FBI considers supplying him with a defective parachute, one that won't open. It's discussed. It's rejected. Because they don't know if he has an accomplice. They don't know what he'll do if he feels he's been tricked. The risks of that gamble are too catastrophic. He gets functioning parachutes. At around 5:30 in the evening, the flight attendant walks back to Cooper with a bag containing the money and the parachutes. He examines the contents with the focused attention of a man who knows what he's looking for. He counts a few of the bills. He checks the parachute rigging. He is satisfied. He tells Captain Scott to release the passengers. All 36 of them. They gather their things with the bewildered, adrenaline-soaked confusion of people who still aren't entirely sure what has just happened to them, and they file off the plane and into the terminal, where FBI agents are waiting to take their statements. Every single passenger is interviewed. Every single one is asked, "Did you notice anything about the man in seat 18C? What did he look like? Did he speak to you?" The descriptions that come back are frustratingly consistent in their vagueness. Medium height, somewhere between 5 feet 10 inches and 6 feet 1 inch. Medium build. Dark hair, possibly oiled back. Olive complexion. Could be 40 years old, could be 50. Dark sunglasses. Black suit. Calm demeanor. He didn't stand out. He wasn't memorable. He was, by design, no one. Back on the plane, with the passengers gone and a refueling truck connected to the aircraft, Cooper gives his next set of instructions. He wants to fly to Mexico City. He wants the plane kept below 10,000 feet altitude and under 150 knots airspeed. He wants the landing gear left down. The crew exchanges glances. Flying that slowly, that low, with the landing gear deployed burns fuel at an extraordinary rate. They tell him they'll need to make a refueling stop. He agrees. Reno, Nevada. Captain Scott plots the course. And Flight 305, now carrying 5 crew members and one very calm man with a bag of money and 4 parachutes, lifts off from Seattle-Tacoma into the dark, wet, stormy night. What happens next is the part of this story that people have been arguing about for 50 years. At around 8 p.m., the flight is somewhere over southwestern Washington state. The landscape below is nothing but darkness, broken occasionally by the distant pinprick lights of small towns. The weather is miserable. Rain sheeting against the fuselage. Wind gusting at 30 miles per hour. The temperature outside is somewhere around 7 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. This is not a night anyone would choose to jump out of an airplane. Which is exactly, many investigators believe, the point. Cooper has instructed the crew to stay in the cockpit. Tina Mucklow has been allowed to stay in the main cabin with him, but at some point he sends her forward as well. He tells her to go to the cockpit and close the door. She does. She goes. And now D.B. Cooper is alone. What happens in those minutes is known only from physical evidence and cockpit instruments, because there are no cameras, no witnesses, no recordings. The crew feels a pressure change in the aircraft. The Boeing 727 has a feature that no other major commercial airliner at the time possessed, an air stair at the rear of the fuselage. Not a door that opens outward, but a fold-down staircase at the tail. You can deploy it in flight. Cooper knew this. He had almost certainly chosen the 727 because of this specific feature. At 8:13 p.m., a warning light illuminates on the cockpit instrument panel. The aft air stair has been lowered. Captain Scott activates the intercom. "Is there anything we can do for you?" he asks. Cooper's voice comes back, flat and clear. "No." That is the last time anyone hears his voice. At some point between 8:13 p.m. and approximately 8:24 p.m., with the plane flying at 10,000 feet through a black, freezing, rain-drenched night over the remote wilderness of southwestern Washington, D.B. Cooper walks to the back of that plane, steps out onto the air stair, and jumps. Into the darkness. Into the storm. Into one of the most enduring mysteries in American history. When the plane lands in Reno and FBI agents swarm aboard, here is what they find. 2 of the 4 parachutes, a front pack and a backpack, are gone. The bag containing the money is gone. Cooper's clip-on tie is still clipped to the seatback of 18C. 8 cigarette butts are in the ashtray. There are partial fingerprints on the armrests and on the whiskey glass, but fingerprints from a man whose real identity nobody knows are worth very little. And on the rear air stair, where it was lowered and where the wind and rain has battered the metal for the last 11 minutes of flight, there is nothing. No footprints. No clothing fibers. No blood. Nothing that tells you definitively what happened in those final moments before he vanished. D.B. Cooper is gone. The FBI begins the largest manhunt in American aviation history. And it turns up nothing. The name D.B. Cooper is almost an accident. In the hours immediately following the hijacking, reporters are working the story from whatever scraps they can get. A journalist contacts a local Oregon man named D.B. Cooper, suspecting a connection that turns out to be completely wrong and based on a miscommunication. But the name is already out there. The wire services have picked it up. And by morning, newspapers across the country are running the story under that name. D.B. Cooper. The hijacker's actual name, Dan Cooper, the alias he used at the ticket counter, gets buried. D.B. Cooper becomes the legend. It's slightly wrong, slightly fictional, and somehow that makes it perfect. It suits the story. It suits the mystery. D.B. Cooper sounds like a folk hero's name. It sounds like somebody out of a dime novel. The FBI's initial investigation is a masterclass in frustration. Within 24 hours, agents are working multiple angles simultaneously. They are interviewing the crew repeatedly, trying to extract every possible detail about the man. They are processing the physical evidence found on the plane. They are combing through passenger flight manifests, trying to identify anyone who might have interacted with Cooper before he boarded. They are reaching out to military and intelligence contacts, because the skill set this man appeared to have, parachuting, aviation knowledge, cool-headedness under pressure, suggested military training. The physical description is circulated nationwide. Artists create composite sketches based on the crew's descriptions. The sketches are published in every major newspaper. Tips flood in. Thousands of them. Tens of thousands, eventually. Every tip leads nowhere. The terrain below the flight path is another nightmare. Southwestern Washington state is not suburban. It is not agricultural flatland you could search with a helicopter and a good pair of binoculars. It is dense, ancient, Pacific Northwest wilderness. Old-growth forest with trees so tall they block out the sky. Ravines and riverbeds. Thick underbrush that can hide a car, let alone a human body. In November, with rain falling every day, it is brutal territory to search. The Army sends troops. The FBI sends agents. The Washington State Police coordinate search parties on the ground. They use helicopters when the weather permits, which isn't often. They search for weeks. They find nothing. No parachute. No money bag. No body. No clothing. Nothing that says D.B. Cooper was ever up in that sky. The working theories begin to multiply almost immediately. The most popular theory among law enforcement in those early weeks is that Cooper is dead. That he jumped into a freezing, violent storm with a parachute in a remote wilderness and simply did not survive. That his body is somewhere beneath that forest floor, being slowly consumed by the wet earth of the Pacific Northwest. That this is a tragedy disguised as a mystery. But there is no body. And without a body, you don't have a conclusion. You have a door that stays open. Permanently. Meanwhile, something strange is happening at the cultural level. Something that the FBI finds almost as troubling as the hijacking itself. People are rooting for him. Within days of the story breaking, something peculiar happens in the American popular consciousness. D.B. Cooper becomes cool. Not universally. Not uncritically. But in a way that is impossible to ignore, the public begins to view this man, this unknown, faceless hijacker who stole $200,000 from an airline and leaped into a storm, not as a criminal, but as something else. Something more complicated and more interesting. A trickster. A rebel. A man who stuck it to the system and got away clean. The timing is everything. This is 1971. This is a country that is seething with resentment toward authority. The corporation. The government. The faceless institution that grinds you up and spits you out. And here comes this man, This perfectly anonymous man, who walks into one of those gleaming institutional machines, the commercial airline, the symbol of modern corporate America, and just takes what he wants and vanishes. He didn't hurt anyone. That's the thing people keep coming back to. He was polite, by all accounts. He released the passengers. He didn't threaten to kill the crew. He had a plan, he executed it, and he left. Ballads are written about him. Bars in the Pacific Northwest start holding D.B. Cooper nights. T-shirts appear with slogans like, D.B. Cooper, where are you? And sell thousands of units. He becomes the subject of novels, films, plays. In 1981, Hollywood releases The Pursuit of D.B. Cooper, a fictionalized account of what might have happened after the jump. It's not very good, but it doesn't matter. The myth needs no help from Hollywood. People hold Cooper festivals. In Ariel, Washington, a small community close to where investigators believe Cooper may have landed, an annual D.B. Cooper Days festival draws thousands of people every year for decades. People dress up as him. They debate his fate over beers. They celebrate him the way you celebrate a local legend. The FBI is not amused. Special Agent Ralph Himmelsbach, the agent who led the initial investigation, is famously and publicly contemptuous of the D.B. Cooper mythology. He calls Cooper a rotten criminal who put innocent lives at risk and got lucky. He resents the romanticization. He understands it, in a grim way. He's a student of human nature as well as criminal behavior, but he resents it. Because for every person writing a Cooper ballad, there is a team of investigators who've spent months combing through wilderness and turning over every rock and running down every lead and coming up empty. Because the folk hero story makes the investigation harder. Because people who might have information, a neighbor who came back from a trip with a lot of cash, a friend who knew how to jump, might feel like protecting Cooper is protecting an underdog instead of protecting a criminal. The mythology, in a very real sense, becomes part of the case. And it will stay that way for 50 years. Over the course of 5 decades, the FBI will officially investigate more than 800 suspects in the D.B. Cooper case. 800. Think about that number. Think about how many man-hours that represents. How many background checks, how many interviews, how many searches of how many records. And at the end of all of it, not one of those 800 suspects has ever been definitively confirmed as D.B. Cooper. But some of them are so compelling, so disturbingly close to fitting, that they deserve to be examined carefully. The first major suspect, Richard Floyd McCoy, Jr. In April 1972, just 5 months after the D.B. Cooper hijacking, a man named Richard Floyd McCoy, Jr. hijacks a United Airlines flight and successfully extorts $500,000 in ransom money before parachuting from the aircraft. He is captured within days, largely because he makes a series of amateur mistakes that Cooper did not. McCoy is a Vietnam veteran. He was trained as a Green Beret. He knows how to parachute. He has experience working with explosives. He is described by people who know him as charming, calm under pressure, and resourceful. The similarities are striking enough that FBI agent Himmelsbach becomes convinced McCoy is D.B. Cooper. He writes a book about it. He argues the case publicly for years. But the FBI officially rejects the McCoy theory. The reasons are several. McCoy's family produces what they claim is a solid alibi, placing him in Provo, Utah on the day of the Cooper hijacking. The physical description doesn't perfectly match. McCoy was younger looking than Cooper, and crew members who saw Cooper up close don't identify McCoy from his photograph. And perhaps most significantly, when McCoy is captured and interrogated extensively, he flatly denies being D.B. Cooper. He'll admit to his own hijacking. He won't admit to the Cooper one. McCoy escapes from federal prison in 1974 and is killed in a shootout with FBI agents a few months later. The McCoy thread goes cold. The second major suspect, Dwayne Weber. Decades later, a woman named Jo Weber comes forward with a startling claim. Her husband, Dwayne Weber, died in 1995. But in his final years, she says, he told her something extraordinary. He told her he was D.B. Cooper. She says that on a visit to the Columbia River area, he became visibly distressed and said, "I left my fingerprints on the aft stairs." She says that when he watched a documentary about the Cooper case, he seemed to know details that had never been publicly released. She says he confessed to her near the end of his life, believing he was close to death. Investigators take this seriously enough to obtain Dwayne Weber's fingerprints and DNA and compare them against the evidence recovered from the plane. The results are inconclusive. The fingerprints don't match the partials found on the aircraft with any certainty. His DNA doesn't connect to any evidence. And Jo Weber's claims, while sincere and compelling, remain unverifiable. Dwayne Weber is neither confirmed nor cleared. The third major suspect, Kenneth Christensen. In the mid-2000s, a man named Lyle Christensen contacts the FBI and the media with his own theory. His brother Kenneth, a former Northwest Orient employee and former Army paratrooper, was D.B. Cooper. The circumstantial case is genuinely interesting. Kenneth Christensen worked for Northwest Orient Airlines. He would have intimate familiarity with the Boeing 727, its layout, its specific features, including the aft air stair. He was trained in parachuting during his military service. After his death, his brother discovered that he had purchased a modest house in cash, an act that was inconsistent with his otherwise modest financial history. He was a heavy smoker, matching Cooper's behavior on the plane. But Kenneth Christensen is 5 feet 8 inches, shorter than most witness descriptions of Cooper. And Lyle's evidence is largely circumstantial. The FBI investigates and cannot confirm the connection. The fourth major suspect, Dan Cassett and the L.D. Cooper theory. Investigators and amateur sleuths have proposed dozens of other candidates over the years. One theory, pushed by a woman named Marla Cooper, is that her uncle L.D. Cooper was the hijacker, and she claims that as a child, she overheard him and his brother discussing the hijacking in terms that suggested direct participation. She submits DNA samples. The FBI tests them against evidence from the aircraft. No match. The fifth major suspect, Robert Rackstraw. Perhaps the most extensively investigated suspect in recent decades is Robert Rackstraw, a man with a resume that reads like it was designed to scream D.B. Cooper. Army veteran, paratrooper, conman, former suspect in his own stepfather's death, convicted forger, impersonator, and thief. A man who has, by his own enthusiastic admission, lived a life of breathtaking dishonesty. Rackstraw is first interviewed by the FBI in 1978 and is considered a serious suspect. He denies involvement. He is never charged in connection with the Cooper case. Decades later, a private team of investigators claim they have found coded messages hidden in letters Rackstraw sent from prison. Messages that, when decoded, allegedly point to accomplices and hidden money. The FBI reviews the new evidence and declines to reopen the formal investigation. Rackstraw, to the end of his life, seems to relish the suspicion. He never fully confirms or denies. He performs the role of maybe Cooper with what can only be described as professional panache. He dies in 2019. The case remains open. For 8 years after the hijacking, the money says nothing. The FBI's photographs of every one of the 10,000 $20 bills exist. The serial numbers are cataloged. Banks are alerted. Law enforcement is watching. If D.B. Cooper, whoever he is, wherever he landed, tries to spend that money, they should know about it. For 8 years, not a single bill turns up. Not one. Then, on February 10, 1980, a family is picnicking on the north bank of the Columbia River, near Vancouver, Washington. An 8-year-old boy named Brian Ingram is playing at the edge of the river, digging in the sandy bank, when his fingers find something unexpected. A bundle of bills. Wet, deteriorating, partially decomposed, but recognizable as money. He pulls them out and calls to his parents. His father examines them. They're 20s. Old, weathered, but real. He counts them, $5,800 worth. The serial numbers are checked. They match. These are D.B. Cooper's bills. The discovery sends a jolt through the case that nobody is quite prepared for. Because on one hand, finding the money is extraordinary. It's the first piece of confirmed physical evidence that has ever turned up in 9 years of searching. But on the other hand, what it tells investigators is deeply confusing. The Columbia River near Vancouver, Washington. The money is found in a location that is south of the flight path and east of the Cascade Mountains. This is not consistent with where investigators thought Cooper landed. Based on the timing of the aft door opening, the flight path, the wind speed and direction that night, the FBI had calculated a primary search area in the mountainous terrain of Skamania County, Washington, which is north and west of where the money turned up. Why is the money here? And how did it get in this specific condition, partially decomposed, but with the rubber bands that originally bundled it still partially intact, though rotted? The bills are in an unusual state of deterioration. They've been exposed to water, but not in the way you'd expect if they'd simply washed downstream from somewhere else. Scientists examine the sand encasing the bills. They find that the sand layers around the money don't match the current composition of that riverbank, which means the money was deposited there at some point in the past and then partially buried by subsequent sediment. This raises an immediate, dizzying question. Was the money placed there deliberately? Or did it wash downriver from somewhere upstream after Cooper lost it, either during the jump or after he landed? The distance from the assumed drop zone to the spot where Brian Ingram found the bills is significant. The Columbia River runs fast and far. Under the right conditions, cash bundled in rubber bands could theoretically travel substantial distances. But the condition of the bills and the way they were found suggests they were there for years before Brian dug them up, and the rubber bands suggest they were still bundled, not scattered. Every theory about the money creates as many questions as it answers. Did Cooper survive the jump and spend some of the money, only to stash the rest somewhere near the Columbia? Did he fall into the river during or after the jump, lose the money bag, and drown? Did he intentionally hide the money there as part of a larger plan that went wrong? The Columbia River discovery is the most significant physical breakthrough in the case, and it explains exactly nothing. Here is the question that every expert, enthusiast, and armchair detective returns to eventually. Could D.B. Cooper have survived that jump? Not as a theoretical exercise, as a practical matter of physics and human endurance. Because the conditions on the night of November 24, 1971, were not the conditions a reasonable person would choose for a parachute jump. Let's lay it out. The aircraft was flying at approximately 10,000 feet above sea level, but the terrain below, particularly in the area of Skamania County in southwestern Washington, sits at a significantly higher elevation in places. The effective jump altitude was potentially much lower than 10,000 feet above the ground. That's important, because lower altitude means less time to deploy the chute and less margin for error. The outside air temperature was approximately 7 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. In a suit, a dress shirt, and a thin tie. In rain. Without any visible cold weather gear beyond what he was wearing when he boarded. The exposure risk alone would have been severe. Survival experts have noted that a man dressed as Cooper was dressed, landing in that environment, would have faced serious risk of hypothermia within minutes of reaching the ground. The wind. The airspeed of the plane during the jump, combined with the ambient wind conditions, meant that Cooper was jumping into wind speeds that could affect his trajectory dramatically. Parachutists calculate these factors carefully, using instruments with preparation. Cooper was jumping blind, in darkness, into weather he could not see clearly. The terrain. We've touched on this. But the area below is not Kansas. It is not a nice flat field with a barn you can walk to. It is steep, heavily forested, Pacific Northwest wilderness. Landing in those trees at night, even with a perfectly functioning parachute, could easily break bones, or worse. And the parachute itself. There were 4 parachutes provided. Cooper took one backpack-style chute and one front-pack-style. The backpack he used for his primary jump chute. The front pack he apparently did not use. It was found, unused, on the plane. Some investigators have noted that one of the reserve chutes provided was a practice model, not designed for an actual jump. Whether Cooper knew this or not, whether it was an accident or a deliberate attempt by someone in the supply chain to handicap him, has never been fully determined. Experienced skydivers who have analyzed the case are divided. Some, particularly military veterans with halo jump experience, say that a trained, experienced jumper could absolutely have survived those conditions. That the temperature and terrain are brutal but not necessarily fatal. That a man who had planned this operation as carefully as Cooper clearly had would have had the skills to execute the jump and walk away. Others say the opposite. That the combination of low altitude, extreme cold, total darkness, dense terrain, and physical exposure make survival extraordinarily unlikely for anyone, no matter how skilled. That the very specific set of conditions Cooper jumped into were essentially a death sentence. One particularly striking data point. In the 45-plus years of searching, not a single piece of equipment from Cooper's jump has ever been conclusively recovered. No parachute canopy caught in a tree. No harness. No money bag, beyond the bills Brian Ingram found in 1980, which may have arrived at the Columbia via water rather than direct deposit. No bones. In wilderness survival situations, the human body and equipment leave traces. Animals scatter bones. Nylon from a parachute canopy can persist in a forest for decades. Rubber and canvas and metal can survive years of exposure. There is nothing. What do you make of a man who jumps from a plane into a storm and leaves nothing behind? For decades, the FBI maintained what became one of the largest investigative files in Bureau history. At its peak, the Cooper case file ran to more than 40,000 pages. 40,000 pages of tips, leads, interview transcripts, forensic analyses, behavioral profiles, aerial photographs, suspect background checks, witness statements, and internal memoranda. It was organized, cataloged, and maintained with the kind of institutional seriousness you'd expect from an agency that does not like to lose. In 2016, after 45 years of active investigation, the FBI officially suspended active investigation of the Cooper case. They didn't close it. They suspended it. The distinction is important. Closing a case means declaring a resolution. Suspending it means saying, we don't have the resources to keep actively working this, but the file remains open. If new evidence emerges, we'll look at it. When the Bureau released a portion of the case files to the public, investigators and enthusiasts finally got access to details that had been held back for decades. Some of those details are fascinating. The fingerprints lifted from the aircraft were, in the FBI's own assessment, incomplete and compromised. The plane had been cleaned multiple times before the full forensic workup, which meant that any prints found were mixed with those of maintenance workers, cleaning staff, and other passengers. Isolating Cooper's actual fingerprints from that noise was never fully achieved. The hair samples collected, including several dark hairs found on the clip-on tie, were subjected to various analyses over the years. In 2011, an independent team used advanced technology to identify trace particles on the tie, including titanium and other industrial minerals. This led to theories about Cooper's possible occupation. Some researchers suggested he might have worked in a technical or engineering field where exposure to those materials was common. The FBI reviewed this analysis and found it interesting but not conclusive. A particularly remarkable document in the files is a behavioral profile created by the FBI's own Criminal Behavioral Science Unit in the 1970s. The profile describes Cooper as likely middle-aged, probably with military service, possibly with aviation or aerospace industry connections, intelligent and self-disciplined, not acting from desperation but from calculation, and exhibiting the behavioral signatures of someone who has planned this for an extended period. The profile is, in retrospect, reasonably good. But a profile is not an identity. The FBI also tracked the cultural phenomenon of Cooper with something close to anxiety. Internal memos discuss the romanticization of the hijacking and express concern that it could inspire copycat incidents. They were right to worry. In the months and years following, there were several attempted hijackings that appeared to be directly inspired by Cooper's plan. None were as successful. Most were captured immediately. Several were fatal for the hijacker. But D.B. Cooper, whoever he was, had created something. A template. An idea. The idea that you could walk into the machine, take what you wanted, and disappear. Of all the people who came face to face with D.B. Cooper on that night in November 1971, no one spent more time with him than flight attendant Tina Mucklow. Florence Schaffner received the note. But Tina Mucklow sat with him for hours. She was his primary contact while the plane sat on the Seattle tarmac. She was the one who shuttled communications between Cooper and the cockpit. She was the one who watched him examine the parachutes and count the money. She was the last crew member to speak with him before she was sent forward. Tina Mucklow's accounts over the years have been the most detailed and the most consistent, and they paint a portrait of a man that doesn't quite fit any of our easy categories. She describes him as courteous, not in the hollow theatrical way of someone performing politeness as manipulation, but genuinely considerate in small, specific ways. When he lit his cigarettes, he blew the smoke away from her. When he gave her instructions, he said please. When she asked him questions, out of genuine curiosity as much as professional necessity, he sometimes answered them. He told her at one point that she shouldn't be nervous, that nobody was going to get hurt. She wasn't sure whether to believe him, but she found herself believing him. He was, she would say later, like someone who had made a decision and was completely at peace with it. Not reckless, not manic, not the way you'd expect someone who is doing something terrifying and illegal to behave. He was settled. Still, almost eerily relaxed. She noted that he seemed to know the aircraft. When he was examining the parachutes near the aft section of the plane, he moved through the space with familiarity. He knew where things were. He wasn't reading signs or looking around in the uncertain way of someone in an unfamiliar environment. He ordered his drinks with confidence. He asked for specific things. He didn't improvise or seem confused at any point. What Tina Mucklow describes is a man who had been here before. Not on this specific aircraft, but in situations of high pressure and consequence. A man for whom the management of his own emotional state was not a problem, because he had trained himself, or been trained, to be calm when other people were not. After the case, Tina Mucklow largely withdrew from public life. She gave interviews in the immediate aftermath, cooperated with the FBI completely, and then, as the years went on, became increasingly private. She reportedly entered a religious community at some point. She has not, in recent decades, been available for the kind of ongoing media engagement that a story of this magnitude typically generates. In the small collection of interviews she gave in the years shortly after the hijacking, one comment stands out above all others. When asked if she thought Cooper survived the jump, she paused for a long time. And then she said something to the effect of, she didn't know. But she found herself hoping he had. Not because she thought what he did was right, but because she had sat with this man for hours on the worst night of her professional life, and something about him made her believe that he deserved whatever came next. That is a remarkable thing for a victim to say about their captor. It tells you something about D.B. Cooper that no FBI file can quite capture. The land beneath the flight path of Northwest Orient Flight 305 is one of the most beautiful and one of the most forbidding landscapes in North America. This is the Pacific Northwest. This is the territory of Douglas fir trees that tower 100 feet above the forest floor, so dense and tall that in some places the canopy blocks out nearly all direct sunlight. This is a land cut through with rivers, the Columbia, the Lewis, the Washougal, that run cold and fast, fed by the snowmelt of the Cascade Mountains. In the decades following the hijacking, this wilderness has been searched in ways that grow more sophisticated over time. Initially, it's ground teams, soldiers, FBI agents, law enforcement, moving through on foot, looking for physical evidence. They are hampered by weather, by terrain, by the sheer scale of the search area. As technology evolves, so do the search methods. Aerial photography, thermal imaging, ground-penetrating radar in accessible areas. Citizen search teams organized by Cooper enthusiasts who have studied the case with the obsessive focus of the truly dedicated amateur. Some of these searchers have devoted years of their lives to specific sections of the search area. One particularly dedicated group, led by retired law enforcement officials and aviation experts in the 2010s, uses modern computational modeling to recalculate the probable jump zone. They feed in the aircraft's known flight path, the timing of the door opening, the wind conditions recorded that night, the aircraft's speed and altitude, and they run the numbers through models designed for exactly this kind of trajectory calculation. Their results suggest a smaller, more specific drop zone than investigators had previously been working from. They search it. They find nothing. The forest keeps its secrets. There are periodic claims over the years. Hikers who found money. Hunters who found bones. Campers who found equipment that might be parachute material. Almost all of these turn out to be unrelated to the case. The few that generate serious interest are investigated by the FBI and come up empty. The most significant claim in recent years comes from a self-described survivor of the event, a man who periodically surfaces to say that he knows where Cooper landed and can lead investigators there. These claims are investigated and consistently fail to produce results. The wilderness does not give up what it swallows. If D.B. Cooper's body is out there, if he died on impact or from exposure shortly after landing, then the forest has been doing its work for 50 years. In that time, the trees have grown. The underbrush has thickened. Rivers have shifted course. Sediment has moved. Whatever physical evidence might have existed in the immediate aftermath of the jump is almost certainly buried now beneath layers of organic matter and geological change. It is, paradoxically, one of the reasons the mystery endures. Dead mysteries stay dead. But mysteries with no definitive ending keep growing. Of all the technical questions surrounding the D.B. Cooper case, the one that has generated the most sustained expert debate is the parachute question. Cooper was given 4 parachutes. 2 primary chutes, 2 reserves. He took 2 of them. He left 2 behind. The one he left behind, the reserve chute, turned out to be an interesting choice, because one of the reserve chutes provided was a training model. It was sewn shut. It had a dummy ripcord. It was never intended to support an actual human body in free fall. It was the kind of chute used for ground training to familiarize students with the equipment. The question of whether Cooper knew this, whether he was savvy enough to inspect the chutes and identify the non-functional one, goes directly to the heart of his level of expertise. If he knew enough to leave the dummy chute behind, he was highly trained and knew exactly what he was looking at. If he accidentally left behind the non-functional chute, he got extremely lucky. The chute he used for his jump was a backpack-style parachute, a military surplus NB-6 parachute, according to the account of the man who supplied the chutes to the FBI that night, a Seattle skydiving school operator named Earl Cossey. Years later, Cossey would give contradictory accounts of which chutes he provided and in what condition. He became something of a controversial figure in the Cooper community, a man who was a critical link in the chain of events, but who seemed, over time, to become less reliable as a source. Earl Cossey was murdered in 2013. An unrelated crime, investigators determined, a home invasion robbery that went wrong. But the loss of this particular link to the physical evidence of the case added another layer of frustration to an already impenetrably layered mystery. The chute Cooper wore when he jumped has never been found. Modern parachute experts note that a nylon canopy from the early 1970s, if it landed in old-growth Pacific Northwest forest and remained undisturbed, could theoretically still be partially intact decades later. Nylon degrades slowly in cool, shaded environments. If it caught in the upper canopy of an old-growth Douglas fir, it could still be hanging there today, invisible from the ground and from the air, slowly weathering into tatters. Nobody has found it. The absence of the parachute is, in many ways, the most haunting piece of the physical puzzle. You can tell stories about a body that decomposes, money that washes away in a river. But a parachute canopy is a large, distinctive object. If Cooper made a successful landing, that canopy went somewhere. He would have buried it or burned it or hidden it. If he didn't survive the landing, it should eventually have been found by someone. Its continued absence is a silence that speaks volumes without saying anything at all. There is a community of people in America, scattered across the country and connected now by the Internet, who have made the D.B. Cooper case the central obsession of their lives. They are not crazy. They are not cranks. Some of them are retired law enforcement. Some are former military. Some are academics, historians, criminologists, behavioral scientists. Some are simply civilians who read about the case once and found they could not put it down. They call themselves Cooperites, sometimes, or Cooper hunters. They have their own websites, their own forums, their own annual gatherings. They share files. They debate theories. They exchange documents obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests. They interview witnesses who are still alive, track down obscure records, commission analyses of evidence using modern techniques. They are, in aggregate, doing what the FBI no longer has the active resources to do. And some of what they have found is genuinely remarkable. One researcher, working from the declassified FBI files and conducting independent interviews, has assembled a database of every identified Cooper suspect and cross-referenced it with military records, airline employment histories, and criminal records. The database has helped narrow the field of plausible suspects in ways that formal investigation never quite achieved. Another researcher focused specifically on the fingerprint evidence, working with a forensic expert to apply modern latent print analysis techniques to the partial prints photographed from the aircraft. Their analysis suggests the prints belong to a right-handed male with unusually small hands for his described height, a physical characteristic that, if accurate, could help narrow the field of suspects. A group of retired Air Force veterans with halo jump experience spent a weekend conducting test jumps in conditions as close as possible to those of November 24, 1971. Similar altitude, similar weather, similar aircraft speed. Their conclusion, after extensive analysis, was that a skilled jumper could survive the jump but would almost certainly have sustained significant injuries upon landing in the type of terrain that exists in the search area. Someone landing in dense forest at night, in the cold, even with a functioning chute, was going to hit branches, roots, slopes. Walking away uninjured would have been nearly miraculous. This raises a question that the Cooper hunting community debates passionately. If Cooper survived the jump but was injured, what happened next? Did he have help? Was there an accomplice waiting for him on the ground? Or did he manage, injured and freezing, to find his way out of the wilderness on his own? The community has no answer. Neither does anyone else. But they keep looking, because in the absence of an ending, the search itself becomes the point. D.B. Cooper did not just commit a crime. He invented one. Not the hijacking that existed before him, but this specific type of hijacking. The ransom extraction, the parachute escape, the careful preparation, the studied calm. This was new. This was a template. And within months, people were using it. In the year following the Cooper hijacking, there were at least 5 separate hijacking attempts that investigators categorize as directly Cooper-inspired. Men who had read about the case, studied the basic outline of the plan, and decided they could replicate it. None of them were D.B. Cooper. The copycats were Messier, less careful, less lucky. One was shot and killed on the tarmac. One was arrested before the aircraft even left the ground. Several were captured within hours of their own jumps, because they hadn't thought through the landing nearly as carefully as they'd thought through the escape. The most successful copycat was Richard Floyd McCoy, whose April 1972 hijacking we've already discussed, and even McCoy, who was by many measures as skilled as Cooper, made mistakes that Cooper did not. The ripple effects of Cooper's plan forced changes to American aviation security that would not have happened, at least not as quickly, without him. The Boeing 727's aft air stair was modified. A device was installed that prevents it from being opened in flight. The modification is called the Cooper vane, and it remains in use to this day. Metal detectors became standard at airport checkpoints, not immediately, not all at once, but the pressure from the wave of hijackings in the early 1970s accelerated their adoption. Sky marshals became more common. Airline security protocols became more rigorous. The cost of one man in a black suit and dark sunglasses paying $30 for a one-way ticket to Seattle rippled out across the entire industry and fundamentally changed the experience of air travel for everyone who came after. This is Cooper's strangest and most concrete legacy. He failed to be caught. His money was almost certainly lost. His fate was almost certainly grim. But because of him, every single person who has passed through an airport metal detector in the last 50 years has, in some tiny and completely unacknowledged way, been affected by what he did. The Cooper vane alone, the device that stops someone from opening an aft air stair in flight, is a piece of hardware that has been installed on every 727 ever built. Every one of them, for decades, bears a small, permanent tribute to the ghost in Seat 18C. Over the decades, there have been several people who have claimed, or whose family members have claimed on their behalf, that they were D.B. Cooper, or that they knew who D.B. Cooper was. None of these claims have been confirmed. But some of them are worth examining carefully, because they reveal the particular human texture of this mystery. The most common pattern is the deathbed confession. A man lies dying, cancer, heart failure, old age, and in his final days or weeks, he says something to a family member or friend that suggests he was Cooper. Sometimes it's explicit, "I did it. I was the one." Sometimes it's oblique, "There are things about me you don't know." Sometimes it's a comment that only takes on significance in retrospect, something recalled years later in a different light. These stories share a peculiar quality. They're usually told by people who deeply believe what they're saying. They're not, in most cases, obvious hoaxes. They're people who loved someone, or at least knew someone, and who are now trying to make sense of a revelation that came to them in the most emotionally charged possible circumstances. What makes them almost impossible to evaluate is the lack of corroboration. A deathbed confession is a specific kind of statement, made when the speaker is physically compromised, possibly medicated, possibly cognitively impaired, and no longer subject to any of the social or legal consequences that would normally attend a confession. These conditions are not conducive to reliable testimony. And there's another dimension. The D.B. Cooper story is so thoroughly woven into American popular culture that any man of the right age and background who has lived a remotely adventurous or morally complicated life might, in his dying moments, consciously or unconsciously try it on. The identity of D.B. Cooper is not just a mystery, it's an invitation. A role to step into. A way of transforming yourself, at the end of everything, into something larger and more legendary than you actually were. Dying is hard. Being ordinary is hard. And if the last thing you say to the people who love you gives them a story that makes your life seem remarkable, what does it cost you? The FBI, for its part, has a policy of following up on any Cooper-related claim that includes specific verifiable details, locations, physical evidence, accomplices, information that was never publicly released. In the overwhelming majority of deathbed or posthumous confessions, those specific details are missing or wrong. The claims that generate the most sustained investigation are the ones where the person describing the confession can produce something tangible: a document, a photograph, a piece of physical evidence, money with matching serial numbers. So far, none of those investigations have produced a confirmed identity. The confessions accumulate. The mystery remains. Stripped of all the mythology, stripped of the folk hero narrative and the FBI files and the anniversary specials, the most fundamental question about D.B. Cooper is a human one. Who was he? Not his name. Not his address. Not his rap sheet or his employment history. Who was he as a person? What shaped him? What drove him to this specific, extraordinary act? Criminal psychologists and behavioral scientists who have studied the case over the years tend to converge on several consistent observations. First, this was not an act of desperation. Desperate men make hasty plans with obvious flaws. Cooper's plan had very few obvious flaws. It was thought through at a level of detail that indicates extended planning and a calm, analytical mind. The choice of aircraft, the choice of timing, the choice of ransom amount, the choice of landing method, all of these suggest a person capable of long-term strategic thinking, not short-term crisis response. Second, the emotional presentation, the calmness, the courtesy, the absence of aggression, suggests a person with significant experience managing high-stress situations. This is consistent with military service, with law enforcement, with certain elite civilian professions. People who are trained to be the calmest person in the room when everyone else is panicking. Third, the choice of $200,000 is interesting. It's a lot of money. In 1971 dollars, it's the equivalent of roughly $1.5 million today. But it's not an absurd amount. It's not $1 billion, not $100 million. It's an amount a private individual might plausibly ask for. An amount that an airline and its insurance company could realistically produce in a few hours. An amount that, if successfully spent slowly over many years, would be enough to live comfortably but not extravagantly. This suggests a person planning a real life after the jump. Not a spectacular fantasy. A real, livable, quiet life. Someone who wanted to change their circumstances. Not conquer the world. Fourth, and perhaps most psychologically significant, Cooper did not appear to enjoy the spectacle. He wasn't theatrical. He didn't make speeches. He didn't express ideology or political views. He didn't seem to relish the power he had over the crew and, by extension, over the airline and the FBI waiting outside. He just conducted his business. Like a transaction. Like something that needed to be done so he could get to wherever he was actually going. This is not the psychology of an exhibitionist. It's not the psychology of someone seeking glory. It's the psychology of someone who has decided that the normal rules of their life are no longer acceptable, and who has found, in this singular, breathtaking act, a door out. Who gets to that point? Who decides, quietly and without apparent anger, that the world they're living in needs to be left behind entirely? That the solution is not another job or another city or another relationship, but a parachute, a storm, and $200,000 in unmarked bills? Someone who has lost something. Or someone who has spent a long time waiting for a life that never came. Or someone who simply decided, one day, that the cost of continuing to be who they were was higher than the cost of becoming nobody at all. Let us be honest about where we are. 50-plus years have passed since a man in a black suit bought a $30 ticket at Portland International Airport. 3 generations of Americans have been born since he stepped off that air stair and into the dark. The investigators who worked the original case have aged and retired and died. The crew members have grown old. The witnesses have scattered. Here is what we know for certain. We know that a man using the name Dan Cooper boarded Northwest Orient Flight 305 on November 24, 1971. We know he hijacked the aircraft, extorted $200,000 in cash and 4 parachutes, released the passengers, instructed the crew to fly toward Mexico, and somewhere over southwestern Washington state, opened the aft air stair and jumped. We know that a portion of the ransom money, $5,800 in 20s, bundled and partially decomposed, was found on the north bank of the Columbia River near Vancouver, Washington in February 1980 by a child named Brian Ingram. We know that no other confirmed physical evidence of D.B. Cooper's fate has ever been recovered. We know that the FBI investigated more than 800 suspects over 45 years and did not confirm the identity of any of them. We know that the case, as of 2016, was officially suspended, not closed, by the FBI. And then there is everything we don't know. We don't know his real name. We don't know where he came from, his hometown, his background, his employment history, his family. We don't know whether he survived the jump. If he died, we don't know where his body is. If he survived, we don't know how. We don't know where he went. We don't know how he spent the money, or if he spent it. We don't know what name he lived under, what life he built, what he told the people around him about who he was. We don't know if he had accomplices. We don't know if the Columbia River money was placed there deliberately or arrived by water. We don't know if the partial fingerprints in the FBI's files match any living or deceased person. We don't know if he is buried somewhere in the wilderness of southwestern Washington state, slowly becoming part of the landscape. Or if he lived to old age, somewhere far away, under a different name, watching the anniversary specials on television with a private, complicated expression on his face. We don't know. And that not knowing is a very specific kind of thing. It's the thing that keeps this case alive. The thing that draws people back to it decade after decade. Because human beings are designed to want resolution. We need stories to end. We need mysteries to be solved. We need, on some fundamental level, to be able to close the book. D.B. Cooper never let us close the book. He walked into a plane, executed an impossible plan, and then vanished so completely that the very completeness of his disappearance has become its own kind of answer. Not an answer to the question of who he was or what happened to him, but an answer to the question of what kind of story this is. This is the kind of story that doesn't end. It just keeps going. There's a reason this story doesn't let go. There's a reason that in the small town of Ariel, Washington, People still gather every year to raise a glass to a man whose name they don't know, whose face they can't confirm, whose fate remains as murky as the storm he jumped into more than half a century ago. There's a reason that when you search D.B. Cooper online today, right now, in 2025, you'll find not just historical records and Wikipedia entries, but active forums, recent podcasts, new books, new documentaries, new theories advanced by new researchers who weren't born when the hijacking happened. There's a reason this case has never been truly put to rest. And the reason is not the money. It's not the parachute. It's not even the audacity of the act itself, as extraordinary as that audacity was. The reason is what D.B. Cooper represents. We live inside systems. We live inside structures of obligation and identity that we didn't fully choose and can't easily leave. We have names and records and credit scores and histories and reputations. We have jobs that define us and families that need us and debts that bind us. We move through life inside the specific shape of who we are, and for most of us, that shape never fundamentally changes. And then there's D.B. Cooper. A man who, one Wednesday afternoon, simply walked out of whatever shape he had been living in and became someone else. Or no one. Who stepped off the edge of his known life and into the dark and said, in the most definitive way possible, I am going to become ungovernable. I am going to become unknown. I am going to be so thoroughly gone that you will spend 50 years looking for me and never find me. That idea is dangerous. Let's be honest about that. The actual crime he committed was real. He terrorized the crew of that aircraft. He put lives at risk. He stole. He deceived. The romanticization of what he did, the folk hero mythology, it papers over actual human beings who were genuinely frightened and genuinely harmed by what he chose to do. And yet there is something in the deepest part of the human psyche that responds to the image of a man in a black suit, briefcase in hand, stepping off the edge of a plane into a dark and stormy sky. Because we have all, at one point or another, wanted to walk out of our lives. Not necessarily to commit crimes. Not to steal or terrorize. But to shed the accumulated weight of who we are. To be nobody for a while. To step off the edge of our known world and find out what we're made of in the darkness and the cold and the wind. D.B. Cooper is what happens when someone actually does it. He is the thing most people only imagine. He jumped. And that's the thing about jumping. Once you do it, you've done it. Whatever comes after, the crash landing, the cold, the hunger, the slow realization that you've bought yourself freedom but also exile, whatever comes after, you have been in the air. For a few seconds, or a few minutes, or maybe a few years, you were free in a way that most people never are. Whether D.B. Cooper survived or not, he was free. And we, who are still on the ground, who are still answering emails and paying bills and living inside our shapes, we can't quite look away. Because what if you could? What if you could buy a ticket, pay cash, and board a plane toward a life you can't quite see yet, in a direction you've never gone? What if you could open the door at the back of everything familiar and step out into the storm and the dark and the rush of wind and just go? D.B. Cooper did that. In November 1971, somewhere over the dark forests of southwestern Washington, a man whose real name we still don't know stepped off the edge and fell through the night toward whatever was waiting for him below. And nobody, not the FBI with its 40,000 pages of files, not the Army with its search parties, not the citizens of Ariel with their annual celebrations, not the legions of Cooperites who have dedicated years of their lives to this question, nobody has ever found him. He is gone. Gone with the storm. Gone with the dark. Gone with $200,000 in bundled 20s and the sound of the air stair hitting the air and the plane banking away through the night. He is the man we cannot find. The ghost that refuses to rest. The legend that refuses to end. And maybe that's the answer. Maybe the mystery is the point. Maybe D.B. Cooper understood something that we're still catching up to, that the most powerful thing a person can be is completely unknowable. That the most durable legend is the one with no ending. That the most perfect escape is the one that leaves nothing behind. Not a body. Not a confession. Not a name. Just a clip-on tie, left on the back of a seat in an empty plane. And the dark sky outside the window. And the long, long question that has been echoing through American culture for more than 50 years. Where did he go? We don't know. We may never know. And D.B. Cooper, whoever he was, wherever he went, whether he's bones in a Washington forest or an old man who died quietly in some small town under a name we've never heard, D.B. Cooper knew we wouldn't. That was the whole point. That was always the whole point. The plane disappears into the cloud cover. The storm swallows the sound of the engines. And somewhere in the dark between 10,000 feet and the forest floor, a man falls through the air. Free. The D.B. Cooper case remains the only unsolved commercial airline hijacking in United States history. The FBI officially suspended active investigation in July 2016, though the case remains technically open. If you have legitimate, verifiable information about the identity of D.B. Cooper, the FBI's tip line remains active. The legend, however, needs no tip line. It will keep itself alive just fine.